Hello and welcome to Foreign Policy Focus. This is episode 208 and I am the show's host Kyle. Joining me on today's show is Marko Marjanovic. He is the deputy editor at RussiaInsider.com. His website is Checkpoint Asia. His work has been published at antiwar.com, the Mises Institute, and the Libertarian Institute. Marko, welcome to Foreign Policy Focus. How are you doing today?
Hey, Kyle, glad to be here.
Well, it's great to have you on. We've been in contact for quite a while now, and you finally got yourself a good microphone. So I have you on the show to talk about this article that you got posted here at Checkpoint Asia. Stalin gifted Hitler victory in 1941, and it cost millions of Russian lives. And from a libertarian position, I find this article just so interesting because, the centrally planned military is, I think, one of the hallmarks and one of the staple traits that all states have. And here you are arguing throughout your article that, having the centrally planned military kind of blew up in the USSR's face, going into World War II. And it was really bad for, the Russian people, and it cost a lot of lives to a Nazi regime. So, I think we're going to have a wonderful conversation here.
Yeah, definitely.
So, to really understand, I guess, why the centrally planned military didn't work here in the USSR, we have to look first to kind of what was going on prior to World War II in the USSR. You already have, the Soviet Union formed, the Communist Revolution has happened. We're in post-World War I world. And, what's going on for the Red Army in the 1930s?
I'll definitely answer that, but let me first say that this is a question I was interested in for two things. First of all, World War II in World War II, the Soviet Union lost more people than any country has ever lost in any war. And, that might be understandable if the Soviet Union actually lost the war, because then we would just say, well, the enemy was just stronger. There was really nothing the authorities could have done to prevent it. The country couldn't have done anything, Perhaps that is the reason. But no, Soviet Union actually won the war, and it actually won it mainly through its own efforts. It is the main actor in the defeat of the Third Reich. So, how exactly does this happen? How do you win a war, which would imply you were the stronger side. You were, and yet you lose so many people. And of course, part of the answer is that, the enemy was so ruthless and brutal. But I mean, that's really not sufficient, Nazi brutality wouldn't have meant anything if they weren't able to penetrate so deep into the Soviet Union in 1941. So, how were they able to do that? And, Stalin will later give the explanation that, as a peace-minded country, they really didn't prepare that well. They didn't quite see the war coming, and he would put that into the same context of, hey, like Americans, they suffered early setbacks also, and the British also, because we're all, peace-minded. But I mean, when you look at it, that's totally not true. Actually, the Soviets were pouring enormous energies into bulking up their security before the war, and yet they're unsuccessful. So we have two factors here. We have a country that is large enough, to really defend itself. It's not that the enemy is that much stronger than it. And also a country that was very much aware that its security is threatened and was reacting to that. And yet, it suffers 25 million dead. And so
I mean, this is really interesting because I haven't studied, especially, the German Soviet theater in World War II extremely well, but, my elementary school or, secondary school education taught that, the Germans picked a fight with the Russians, who were just this massive enemy. And, there was no way the Germans were ever going to win. And that was kind of, all they got into it and kind of showed the picture on the map that Russia is a lot bigger than Germany. So, that's how you equate that Russia had more people to spend on the war effort. And, the Russians really didn't care about their people. They just kind of, marched them up to the front lines, and, the guy in front of you died, he picked up his gun and he ran forward with it.
Well, I mean, that's not exactly true. I mean, the Soviets by 1944, they actually have their own quite severe manpower problems, like their divisions when they march into Berlin, they maybe have strength And, the rifle thing, I mean, that's the farthest thing from the truth. It's actually, somewhat the other way around. The Soviets are actually able to outproduce the Germans in every year of the war, and they're able to do so even though their industrial capacity is objectively lower. They just have fewer industrial workers, fewer factories, especially once you count in that the Germans are able to draw on the industry of entire Europe, where the Soviets actually lose 30 to 40% of its industry in 1941. So actually, in this respect, the Soviet performance is exceptional. You wouldn't think that a communist system would be very efficient in production, but when it just comes to spitting out, just very basic armaments, they were actually a lot better at it than the Germans. They had their stuff together better. So, but the thing is, even though they had that many weapons and many times good ones, many times, very advanced hardware, early on in the war, they just lose that, very easily without having to show much for it, without inflicting, defeats on the Germans.
So I guess leading up to actually World War II, starting off here, what is the state? And you said that, for being a communist state, and I think maybe a libertarian bias would be that, they build everything terribly, but you say they're able to build weapons well. So, what kind of is the state of the Red Army in the 1930s?
Well, after the Civil War, the Soviet Union really demilitarizes very, very, very quickly. So through the 1920s, the army is not a priority. It's very small. It's not. There's zero investment basically in the military, and it's not where the best people go. If you're smart, you make yourself a factory manager. If you are, if you have some. If you did good things in the Civil War, you're a good local party chief. You definitely don't want to go into the military, or if you have to, you don't want to stay there. So it has a small officer corps. Plus, these guys are not necessarily the best and the brightest. And actually, sometimes officers will serve at least partially under coercion. So, for example, the party will say, to its cadres, well, we need people there, so we need you there, and so, if you're a young party member, they just send you to an officer school, and then you're expected, to be an officer at least for a few years. But, people like that obviously are going to be, terribly motivated, to make themselves the best officer ever, or to really train the ranks, in the best possible way. But, people who might be, inclined, to nonetheless, pursue a military career, even though it's not that prestigious, in the early Soviet Union, are, the people who used to form the officer class in the imperial era. But here's the rub: they're barred from military service until 1936. They're actually legally barred from even being conscripted. So if you're a former aristocrat, if you're a wealthy peasant, if you're petty bourgeois, and in many cases if you're a Cossack, you cannot, this is close to you, such a career. So, this compounds the problem that smart people just don't go into the military. And, until 1931, the Soviet Union has 500,000 people under arms. Not a huge number for its population. Because, it can't even support the bigger one. And, the economic growth is really the priority in this era. That begins to change in 1931 when Japan takes over Manchuria. The Soviet Union is a little bit spooked by that. It starts to increase its military. It starts to build some tanks for it. And then in the 1930s, in a few cycles, it really wants to expand rapidly. But really the way it wants to expand is too rapidly, so on the eve of the war, it will have 6 million men under arms, but that is an army that is under half strength. So the plan is that when the war actually breaks out, 6 more million will join the military, will be mobilized. So, it should swell, in a week or a few weeks, to 12 million, so basically what I want to do is go from 500,000 to 12 million, in 10 years. And, and that will just cause, enormous problems. But, you might detect a pattern here, is that, the Soviets, they had this very ambitious plan of military expansion in the 1930s, just like, they were enormously ambitious in everything, that like they were always setting these impossible targets, that actually set them back, because they're so unrealistic, that they create so many imbalances.
Yeah, I mean, this is really interesting, especially just since, being an American today, the idea that, being in the military would be the go nowhere position is crazy. But, that I guess that's just a different values, and when you have these massive bureaucracies, whatever bureaucracy you're going to get promoted through is probably, the best one to be in. And there's not like a futuristic hope going through the military. You don't have the, the talented people going there. But you have this massive military buildup, and in your article, you talk about the USSR starts to intervene in some other countries around the world, and I'm sure that most Americans probably are completely unaware that the USSR was intervening at the same time that the war threat was kind of heating up in the rest of Europe.
Yeah, and to first remark a little bit on your comment. Yeah, it was actually the same, in the post-war Soviet Union, like being an officer was very prestigious, and the Soviet military was one of the most respected institutions. So really, the values, of the society and the country, change, they do a U-turn, precisely because of World War II. And actually, the authorities actually gain a lot more legitimacy, before World War II, the Soviets weren't really, they didn't really have a lot of legitimacy in the countryside, but due to the victory in World War II, that changes. Okay, so the Soviet interventions. Yeah, and actually I spent a lot of time talking about that, everything that the Soviet Union tried to do, not just domestically, not just building up its military, but also, on the international, arena, just to point out, that Stalin's explanation after the war, of why they lost so many people, it just doesn't make sense. It's just a lie, because it's very obvious from the Soviet foreign policy that they're taking, the threat of Germany and of Japan very, very seriously, and they're reacting, in various ways. And as it turns out, their problem is really that, again, that they do too much rather than too little. So, in the Far East, it kind of works out for them. First, they're sending a lot of material to the Chinese, to the nationalist Chinese, because because Japan is invading them, so they want to make sure, that the Chinese aren't defeated, so that the Japanese are occupied. But, later on, they go to a plan B, and by early 1941, they successfully conclude, a neutrality pact with Japan, and as part of that, they have to stop sending supplies to the Chinese, so, it's a different approach to solving their security problem. And in Europe, they end up doing the same. So, first of all, in the beginning, they're very interested, in trying to, work with Britain and with France, to try and check Germany. But after the München Agreement in 1938, where Chamberlain allows Hitler, to take a part of Czechoslovakia in return of promise that this is his last territorial demand and there is going to be no war. They really come away from that, with disappointed and with more suspicion than ever, that the evil capitalist plan is really, for everyone to just gang up on them, and that these tensions between France and Britain are not that serious. So again, they go for plan B, and they conclude a pact with Hitler, the non-aggression pact. And as part of that, they also divide, territories between them, into influence zones. So the way Soviets interpret that, is that allows them to recapture pretty much any territory that the Russian Empire held before World War One. So they take over the Baltic states. They issue territorial demands against Romania and Finland, and Romania cedes without a fight, where Finland does fight. And this was actually supposed to enhance Soviet security, right? It means that the Soviets now have more people, more territory, more industries, more resources, but actually it doesn't, because I mean, what? They take a piece of Romania, but it actually causes the monarchy there, to be toppled by fascists, and to side with Hitler. And, it causes, Finland, which, remains democratic, but nonetheless, starts to cooperate with Axis and will take part, in the German invasion of the Soviet Union. So actually what it does, in the long run is just gives Hitler, hundreds of thousands, of allied soldiers.
Well, I mean, it sounds like their foreign policy is blowing up in their face just about as bad as American foreign policy tends to blow up in ours today. But just wondering, we have this massive military expansion, and then it looks like, they start to use it to intervene in other areas, around their borders and in their region. What are the results though of the military expansion? Does Stalin create here a very high quality military, or, does it have some flaws? And, like you said, you point out that, he's able to fight some conflicts and send some weapons to the Chinese. So, what are, I guess, just the results of the Stalin's military expansion through the 1930s?
All the wars they fight, in the 1930s, they win. They have a border conflict with Japan. They invade Finland, but all of these conflicts actually reveal, like enormous deficiencies of the Soviet military, which is really to be expected, because when you look at it, the state of the military on the eve of the German invasion, it is just it's just a shambles. It has just 80% of its military of the officers it needs, and many of these are and on the platoon and infantry level, 2/3 of them are just regular conscripts, so, you are conscripted for 2 or 3 years. Later, after 38, it's 3 years. So, and, early, let's say after boot camp, you're identified as, maybe a little bit brighter or something like that. So the military will send you to this, it's not a real military academy. It's just a crash course, to become an officer, which lasts 5 months. But, sometimes it actually even lasts 3 or 4. And then you're returned, and now you're what is called a younger lieutenant, and you command a platoon. And maybe the next year, or 2 years after that, you will be elevated, to command a company. And even though you're doing that, you're not really seen, as a real officer, by the rest of them, and you're not really expected to stay in the military. So this is the kind of leadership, in the military. It's really, the military was expanded so fast that almost everyone is way beyond, is serving as an officer way beyond their competency level. You have some regular lieutenants who are serving as battalion commanders. Actually, that is very common. Guys who've been in the military for like 3 years, who perhaps can't even command a company properly, are expected to command a battalion. So it turns out, that you can increase the military, the stroke of a pen. You can go from 500,000 to 6 million. But in practice, that is much more difficult. And you see that, also in technology. I mean, well, one thing that the Soviets do a little bit better at, is providing this military, with tons of hardware. But here's the rub, they have 15,000 aircraft, which is an enormous number at this time. Like when the Germans invade, they will use on the Eastern Front, just something like 2,000. But here are Soviets with 15,000. But here's the interesting thing. They have enough crews only for like 80% of them. And only like 20% of these crews are fully trained, are able to fly in bad weather. If it's raining, most of their pilots cannot fly, because, they've only been pilots for a very short time.
Right, and they lack all the technical stuff that we have today that can maybe offset if you're somewhat unskilled. But yeah, I imagine that flying in clouds would have to be extremely difficult if you have like no training, and then to try to like find the people that you're actually supposed to be targeting, would probably be near impossible. So it seems like that would be a real problem. Are there any other problems, with the Red Army at this time? I know one of the things you pointed out that I thought was very interesting is that, Russia is just so vast that it would take a long time, just to get things from the East Coast, right, East Coast to the West, the western edge of the USSR. So, what are the other problems that there are with the Red Army, right before, I guess, the invasion here?
Well, a very obvious one is, you have this military, that is desperately short of officers, and what is done, a huge officer purge. As part of the Great Terror of the late 30s, that also hits the military, because, first of all, because many officers are in the party, and it starts as a party purge. So, you have this desperate shortage of officers. So, hey, let's kill a bunch of them and imprison a bunch of them, and fire a bunch of them. Because, if you're thrown out from the party, you also lose your officer job. So, and as part of that, the military loses 30,000 officers, but 10,000 are then, put back into service. But okay, so it permanently loses 20,000. If you lose 20,000 men in a war, that's a big deal. But if you lose 20,000 officers, that is, that's just devastating. But, there would have been shortages even without the purge. But, more than just, losing the number of officers, the thing is, like the top commander, he's killed, and like, when he's killed, like the doctrine, that he was arguing for, well, that becomes, suspect, politically incorrect, So, like, the tactics, the strategies that the military swore by, for many years now. Well, no, that all goes down the gutter now, the military, is expected, to change up. And that is another thing, like, especially after the Winter War, like problems are identified, and the response, as always, is enormously ambitious. Let's have this massive reform program, and what that does, is again, it creates, a huge state of flux, So, so you have a military where everything is always changing up, nothing is stable, like no officer, is in his position, for like much more than a year or two, just because he's getting promoted all the time. And like, I don't know, like 4 top, commanders of the Air Force are fired or worse, in the last 2 years before the war. I mean, the Soviets at this time just seem incapable of, just having, a settled military, of some kind of organization, that makes sense to its people, where people know what they're doing. And the reforms aren't supposed to be complete until 42, and also their expansion isn't really supposed to be complete until 42. So they also totally miss time. They think they have time that they don't have. Which is really Stalin's failure. The most.
So I mean, you're talking here and you're pointing out all the deficiencies of the Soviet army. However, as you point out, they increased their ranks from 500,000 to 12 million, and they have all this technology, even if they don't have necessarily the people to use it. So it seems like maybe they're still in some kind of position to be ready for the Germans. So when the Germans finally do come to invade the USSR, are they ready? What happens? Can they repel the attack?
Yes, you're right. I mean, what I have, is still a decent force, but they make it worse. They just make it worse. Like Stalin stubbornly insists that there can be no attack in 41. And because he has this opinion, he's a top boss. There's very little anybody else can do about it. Even though there's so many people who disagree. But then again, there's no freedom of the press. So it's not like the rank and file know anything about this. So when the war comes, there's still even just mentally, like everyone is on a peace footing. And the military is totally mal-deployed. Like only half of the military is actually in the Western theater. The rest is, totally spread out around the country, or worse, is in Siberia or is in the Far East. And here's the thing. Yeah, not only do they not have people, to use all this technology, but also, to maintain it. And part of the reason is because they only have half of their supply people and maintenance people during peacetime, because the other half is supposed to join only when war breaks out. But they already have most of their hardware. So the result is they cannot maintain a huge chunk of their hardware. I mean, there are some reports, that actually majority of their tanks are out of order. So, they have 18,000. I mean, that's way more than the entire rest of the world combined. But supposedly majority of them, are not in working order. Because, it turns out it's easier to make a tank, because the people you have for that don't necessarily have to be very skilled, right? But, if you're a mechanic, you almost have to know how everything works in a tank. You have to be able to fix everything, not just put the two parts together on the assembly lines. So, so a huge technical deficiency there, in reality. And then, the Soviets being very ambitious, like we're communists, we have this great system, we can do things that others cannot, always geared up their military, to fight on the offensive, and definitely not on territory of the Soviet Union, So when the war breaks out, even though it really doesn't make sense for them to do anything, I mean, they're not deployed, right? In the actual theater, they're actually outnumbered by the Germans who come in with nearly 4 million, where they have 2.8 million, the Soviets. So, I mean, they're outnumbered, and your military is not in a great state. So what are you to do? Well, probably you should combine, tactical retreats, with some kind of a defense. Probably not anything too complicated. Static defense will do. But no, instead, over and over again, they're telling the units, no, go on the counterattack, like rip into the German flank and stuff like that. And, they're really not capable of doing that, effectively. Because of their, inherent deficiencies of the units at this time, but also, just because of the situation. I mean, their communications are broken down, they don't have good supplies, and yet, they're expected to go on the attack, against a locally superior enemy. So, I mean, the result here is that, in just short 6 months, the Germans are at the gate of Moscow, but even more, tellingly, Soviets have such enormous losses, something like 4 or 5 million, that they're effectively, the military they had on the eve of the war has ceased to exist. I mean, they still have a bunch of people under arms, but by and large, these are new people, because all the other guys, have been captured, So now the Soviet Union is like in this insane position, I mean, from here on, it will go to win, but it basically has to claw its victory, from this incredible low point, of having lost its pre-war military, So it has to rebuild it, while at the same time it has to stop the Germans. And obviously, the requirements of these two objectives, are totally opposite. You want to build your military, you have to give your unit some chance, to gel, and to gain some skill and to be properly equipped. But you also need to throw something in front of the Germans fast, just to stop them, because, if they take over more of your industries, more of your population base, you are doomed. So, and here, is another reason why all these, in 1942, in 1943, the Soviets, will have such enormous casualties, in the battles, because they're fighting, with the military that has been cobbled together, very quickly.
So one of the more interesting things I read through when I read your article is just this realization that Joseph Stalin wasn't the, like some kind of great military leader. I feel like that's how he's always been portrayed, is that, if nothing else, he was a strong man who, was like some kind of great, especially military leader. If you see him, he looks like he's in military garb in all of his photos. And, when they talk about, the people who defeated Nazi Germany, they always talk about, FDR, Churchill, and Stalin. And so, you've gone through quite a few of the blunders of the USSR here, but are there any others that just like stand out as being things that like are inexcusable and unbelievable mistakes that they have made throughout this time that, could have led to, millions of, Russian and, lives of the people of the Soviet Union being saved?
Well, I mean, talking about Stalin, the blunder that falls most squarely into his court is just the one I already mentioned, and that is that he just stubbornly denied the possibility that the Germans are going to invade in 1941, even though to people like he was getting all the reports, right? He's getting all the reports, and all these people, lower ranks, they have access to far fewer, intelligence reports than he does. And yet, this is obvious to them, like it's a great chance the Germans are going to invade. But, there's very little, they can do, when he refuses that possibility. And, and here we have, a system where, there is no free press, so like the Soviets are capturing all these, German agents, like the Germans are always violating, Soviet airspace. And, if you had free press, like maybe all of that would be reported in it, and, just a public debate would develop, that would eventually sway the minds of the authorities. But you just don't have that, Stalin, just cherry picks, like what reports he's going to believe. And, he just continues to work, closely with Germany, to appease it, So under the non-aggression treaty, right, there's also a commercial part, where Germany is going, the Soviet Union is going to, ship fuel and food, to Germany. Two things that Germany very much lacks in this, it cannot produce enough for itself, even counting in Romania. And the Germans are like, behind on their payments, like by an obscene amount, so they're not even paying for that, and he just continues those shipments, as in, let's not provoke, Hitler, he's thinking all kinds of things, like maybe the British are, trying to set up a war between the Soviets and the Germans, so let's try to avoid that, by playing nice and all that. And, here's the thing. The Germans actually, they're very optimistic how their invasion of the Soviet Union is going to go. But as they plan it, they actually become more optimistic, And part of the reason is because they see what they read in Stalin is weakness, they're thinking, look, we're violating their airspace all the time and they won't even fire at us, And Stalin gave the order, don't fire at them, because he doesn't want to for something to happen that's going to spiral out of control or provoke the Germans or whatever. But the Germans just read that, as a weakness, so he's not even efficient, at deterring them, even though he has this huge military, like when the Germans invade, they'll be shocked, by how giant his military was, and might have given them pause, But no, instead, they become more and more convinced that he's weak and that the invasion is going to take, a laughably, a very, very short time. And what you said, like Stalin, he's at least seen, as this big military leader. Well, the thing is that Stalin was actually himself aware and embarrassed, by how poorly the Soviet Union did in World War II early on. And we see that by the fact that, the figure of 25 million war debt, well, he covered that up. He actually claimed that the Soviet Union lost just 7 million. And, this issue of Soviet war losses was taboo after the war. You weren't really supposed to look too closely into that research too much. And actually in 49, there's supposed to be a population census. Well, there isn't one because, that would right away expose, the 7 million figure as a lie, So we have to wait until Khrushchev, for actually to be a population census, and for a better estimate to come out, of 20 million dead. But it isn't until, Gorbachev that researchers are actually, allowed, to really look at this freely, and they return back with a number of 26 to 27 million. So yeah, Moscow, the Kremlin, the Soviet authorities, they were aware, of just how delegitimizing this was for them. That they had allowed, such enormous losses to occur.
I mean, this is really an amazing thing, as you point out, that these are enormous losses. I think you said at the beginning, like the most losses on one side of a war ever. And yet going into the war, we talk about them having a 12 million man army, them having, plenty of equipment in it. It wasn't, as I said in the beginning, kind of maybe a libertarian would immediately think, that the Soviet army was just funded because, or not underfunded, but under equipped too, just because of the shortages that are, so emblematic of communism. Yet here we have the problem not being that, and that there were plenty of, tanks and planes and guns for everyone. The problem was just that they couldn't be utilized in the right way. So, I think that's one of the really important themes that I picked up from your article is that just because you have a straw man in power, just because you have a bunch of people who are going to do what he says and have the technology and the equipment to do so, doesn't mean that you're going to net success.
Yeah, absolutely. And, to judge, Stalin fairly, we could say, that he got a lot of things right, but it turns out, that you just need to get, two or three things, like horribly wrong, and it just has, it can have enormous catastrophic consequences, especially, when this, when the enemy invading you is in the long term actually thinking that, of setting up conditions, where you people are just going to die out. So let's think about it. You have this one, uniform military, where, ultimately all the important decisions are made, by one guy, by the one head honcho or, maybe a small council of people. So, what does that mean? It doesn't matter how smart they are, they're going to get, one or two or three things wrong, nobody can predict the war, that well. But here's the thing, when they get something wrong, it will be manifested, across your entire military. And, Stalin just got, this, sometimes, it can be a small thing, maybe the kind of infantry division, that they set up turns out, to not be ideal, but not all your infantry divisions are like that. They can all be defeated in one way, whereas, if you have some kind of a decentralized military, like everything is a little bit different, you don't have that weakness. You don't have one weakness, that is reflected across your entire force. And of course, you can also say, oh well, but if like almost, like every division or even a small unit is able to make all these decisions for itself, you're never going to have a situation, where everybody gets everything right. No, of course not. But that's a much that's a much less serious problem to have, because think about actually that is and like the variety is actually a good thing, because let's think of what always happens in a war. The military establishment, spends 20 years, speculating on what the next war will be like. And then they always surprise, because there's so many variables. War is just, inherently unpredictable. And, so what actually happens is, they look at the performance of the units, and then they tweak them. So how it actually works, how militaries actually get better isn't by theorizing before the war, it's by experimentation once the war actually starts. But look, you have a uniform military, right? All your units are exactly the same. Every armored division of yours is the same. Every infantry division of yours is the same. So what that means? That means that always you're running just one experiment, at any given time. You're just testing the one infantry division, But let's say you have a decentralized force, like majority would probably, even though they're able to make decisions for themselves, they would network and, they would agree on a lot of things, it would bell curve. Majority of units would be very much alike. But you always have some mavericks, like some guys who would just, prevail, on their own units, to be organized in a different way, So, and that's an amazing thing, because maybe instead of just running, like one experiment, you're running 30 or 40 of them, because you got 30 or 40 different types of division. So like you can, you would get the information, what is, ideal order of battle much faster, and once you have that information, it's child's play, for the year to start to move to that format.
Yeah, one of the things that I thought was interesting was just like, realizing how powerful the Soviet military was then. And, just remembering how powerful the American military is now. And just because we have 12 aircraft carriers, more than all the other countries in the world combined, and we have the F-35 and the THAAD missile defense systems and the TOW anti-tank missiles and all these other different weapons that all have all these cool names, doesn't necessarily mean that, if a conflict were to occur, we can't just assume that we're going to win because we have the most weapons, I guess. And, that's a pretty powerful message, in that if you have a leader in charge who's just incapable of operating the military, then it's not going to turn out well for us. And, this is another reason where decentralization would be a great thing, because if everybody's like you have right now betting all their chips on the F-35, which turns out to be not all that great of a warplane or whatever. I know the new USS super aircraft carrier, the Ford class, they're having a lot of problems with their propulsion systems. The new where the destroyers are likewise having problems with their hulls. Well, everybody's bet their chips on the same, product coming out again and again, even though they had these systemic issues. And so now we end up with the entire military with, the same problems with all the equipment where, maybe if the different leaders of the different brigades could pit their own weapons that they wanted to have, then at least you have some decentralization, and some of the, commanders continue to stick with the A-10 over the F-35 because it's a superior warplane.
Yeah, just mathematically, it's an issue of downside and upside, and the upside of having a uniform military, is quite small, but the potential downside, is just catastrophic, like you say, the U.S. Navy is mainly built around the carriers. Well, what if it turns out, that they're outdated, that they're hardly outdated, that they're just floating targets, it's game over. And, that doesn't matter, like maybe that's a good thing, the U.S. is today, is just an empire that's just bullying everybody else, but let's say it's a different situation. Let's say you're being invaded by the Nazis, and you bet everything on the wrong card. And, I'm not saying that is going to, and that's not necessarily to happen a lot, but it only needs to happen once. And you're 25 million people short.
All right. Awesome. Well, if you have no other parting thoughts, then, this was a great conversation. I think I've had like more and more of my guests, on to talk about some of the more libertarian philosophical topics as it relates to foreign policy, just because it is really important to understand like the fundamental flaws that come when you try to centrally plan an entire military and an entire empire like the USSR did back in the 1930s and into the 1940s and World War II, and like the United States is doing today. So where can my audience find your other work? You do a lot of great work, especially I like Checkpoint Asia as a site that I go to often. So tell people where to find you.
Checkpoint Asia and my day job, Russia Insider. I have a very big archive there as well.
All right. Twitter or Facebook?
Follow Checkpoint Asia on Facebook. I'll be grateful for that.
All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show today. Sure, I'll have you back on again in the future. For those of you who like to take the time to share this episode, foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com and libertarianinstitute.org. Twitter is at KYAAALE, and Facebook is Libertarian Union. Thanks, everyone.